Have you ever stared into the eyes of a man who knows he is already dead? The silence inside the Palace Chop House was louder than the gunshots that had just torn through the air. It was October 1935, and the floor was stained with the blood of the most feared man in New York. But the order to kill didn't come from a judge or a jury. It was the brutal climax of a mob war that had turned the streets of Uptown into a slaughterhouse. This wasn't just a battle for territory. It was a collision of two worlds. On one side stood Dutch Schultz, a man whose greed was as boundless as his cruelty. On the other stood a figure of quiet elegance and lethal intellect, known to history as the Harlem Godfather. While Schultz fought with rage, Bumpy Johnson fought with the mind of a chess grandmaster. They were battling for the soul of the numbers game, a multi-million-dollar empire built on nickels, dimes, and hope. How did one man, facing the full weight of segregation and the Mafia, manage to checkmate the most violent gangsters of the 20th century? The answer lies buried in the concrete of Harlem. History has a way of carving men out of the circumstances they are born into. For Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the chisel was sharp, precise, and held by the hands of the Jim Crow South. Born in Charleston, South Carolina, he wasn't bred for the street corners of New York, but for the classrooms he would never be allowed to lead. He was a prodigy, a boy who could quote Shakespeare and history with the same ease that other children played marbles. But in the South, an intelligent black boy was a target. His family moved him north to Harlem for safety, hoping to save him from a lynching. Instead, they sent a shark into an ocean of blood. Harlem in the early 1930s was a world of dualities. Jazz clubs that glittered like diamonds and tenements that smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. Young Ellsworth carried a bump on the back of his head, a physical trait that gave him the nickname Bumpy Johnson. But it was what lay inside that head that made him dangerous. He didn't just fight, he studied. He walked the streets with a book under one arm and a switchblade in his pocket. He understood that in a world rigged against him, violence was simply a tool for negotiation. He became an enforcer, but not the kind who yelled. Bumpy was the quiet man in the room, the one who didn't need to raise his voice because his silence promised consequences far worse than any threat. He was crafting the persona that would one day make him the Harlem Godfather. Miles away in the Bronx, a different kind of monster was being forged. Arthur Flegenheimer, known to the underworld as Dutch Schultz, was not a man of books. He was a creature of pure, unadulterated appetite. If Bumpy was a scalpel, Schultz was a sledgehammer. He rose through the ranks of the underworld not by outsmarting his enemies, but by brutalizing them until they simply ceased to exist. Schultz was the product of the Prohibition era's most violent excesses. He made his fortune bootlegging beer, drowning New York in illegal alcohol and leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. He was paranoid, loud, and dressed cheaply despite his millions, a man who would kill a waiter for bad service just as easily as he would a rival boss. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, the easy money from alcohol dried up. The mobs were thirsty for a new revenue stream. Schultz, ever the predator, looked south toward Harlem. He didn't see a community. He saw a bank vault left unlocked. He saw the numbers game. To the outside world, the numbers racket was just illegal gambling, a penny lottery played by the poor. But to Harlem, it was the lifeblood of the economy. It was the poor man's stock market, where a nickel could turn into rent money, where a dime could buy a new pair of shoes. It was run by local bankers, the most famous of whom was Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of numbers. She was fierce, independent, and she had already begun to sense the sharks circling in the water. When Dutch Schultz decided to move in, he didn't knock. He kicked the door down. He saw the black operators of Harlem not as rivals to be respected, but as victims to be harvested. He assumed they would fold at the first sight of Tommy Gun. He assumed that without the backing of the Italian Mafia, Harlem was defenseless. It was a miscalculation born of arrogance. Schultz thought he was walking into a pasture to slaughter sheep. He didn't realize that standing between him and the prize was a man who had spent his life waiting for a war. Bumpy had found his calling working for Madame St. Clair. She saw past the street thug exterior and recognized the strategist within. She didn't just hire a bodyguard. She hired a general. While Schultz operated on impulse and rage, Bumpy Johnson operated on logic. He knew that a direct assault against Schultz's army, backed by corrupt police and heavy weaponry, was suicide. So, he prepared for a different kind of war. He studied the alleyways, the rooftops, and the cellars of Harlem. He mapped the neighborhood like a chessboard. The stage was set. The Bronx beer baron was marching toward 125th Street, hungry for the millions flowing through the numbers game. He brought with him the full weight of the syndicate's terror. But waiting for him in the shadows, cleaning his glasses and checking the edge of his blade, was the man who would teach the mob war veterans a lesson in fear. The collision was inevitable, and when it happened, it wouldn't just change the criminal underworld. It would rewrite the rules of power in America. When the war finally arrived, it didn't come with a declaration. It came with the sound of shattering glass and the smell of gunpowder. Dutch Schultz unleashed his soldiers on Harlem like a pack of starving wolves. They weren't interested in diplomacy. They raided the betting parlors, beat the runners who collected the slips, and terrorized the shopkeepers who allowed the numbers game to operate in their backrooms. Schultz's message was simple and bloody. Pay tribute to the Bronx, or pay with your life. He put a price on the heads of the local operators, forcing many to flee or kneel. But he hadn't accounted for the man standing in the shadows of 125th Street. Bumpy Johnson did not kneel. While others saw a terrifying invasion, Bumpy saw a tactical opportunity. He knew he couldn't match Schultz man for man or gun for gun. The Dutchman had an army. Bumpy had a neighborhood. He turned Harlem into a fortress, using the very streets that Schultz despised as his greatest weapon. This was the beginning of a legendary mob war, one that would be studied by gangsters and lawmen for decades to come. Bumpy's strategy was pure guerrilla warfare. He knew the rooftops, the basements, and the secret passageways connecting the tenements. When Schultz's men rolled into Harlem in their heavy sedans, they found themselves fighting ghosts. Bumpy's crew would strike fast, a sudden ambush from an alleyway, a tire shot out from a rooftop, and then vanish before the smoke cleared. They didn't stand and fight. They hit and ran. It was psychological torture for the invaders. Schultz's enforcers, used to the open intimidation tactics of bootlegging, found themselves terrified to step out of their cars. The hunter had become the hunted. The brilliance of Bumpy Johnson lay in his understanding of leverage. He knew that for Dutch Schultz, this was about money. If Bumpy could make the cost of doing business in Harlem higher than the profit, Schultz would bleed out. Bumpy orchestrated kidnappings of Schultz's key lieutenants, not to kill them, but to send a message. He would intercept the Dutchman's money drops, seizing the cash to fund his own defense. Every dollar Schultz lost was a victory for Harlem. The streets began to whisper the name of their defender with a mixture of fear and awe. He wasn't just a gangster anymore. He was the Harlem Godfather, the only man strong enough to keep the wolves at bay. The violence escalated to a fever pitch in 1935. Bodies began to pile up, but for every man Bumpy lost, he made sure Schultz lost too. The numbers didn't stop, but the flow of money to the Bronx was choked off. Bumpy was fighting a war on two fronts, holding off the Italians and Schultz, while keeping the local police confused and paid off. His intellect shone brightest here. He negotiated with detectives just as skillfully as he wielded a knife. He presented himself not as a chaotic criminal, but as a necessary order, a man who kept the streets safer than the erratic, violent Schultz ever could. Meanwhile, Dutch Schultz was unraveling. The Dutchman is not used to losing, and certainly not to a black man from Harlem. His rage made him sloppy. He screamed at his capos, executed his own men for minor failures, and started making wild threats against the city's officials. He couldn't understand why the Harlem problem wasn't solved. He threw more men and more guns at the situation, but it was like punching water. Bumpy was everywhere and nowhere. This era defined Bumpy's legacy. He walked the streets of Harlem like a king, dressed in impeccable suits, greeting neighbors with the tip of his hat. He paid rents for struggling families, bought turkeys for Thanksgiving, and funded school tuitions. This wasn't just charity, it was insurance. The community became his eyes and ears. If a strange car entered the neighborhood, Bumpy knew about it before the engine was turned off. He had built an empire of loyalty that money couldn't buy. In the heart of the mob war, he proved that power wasn't just about who had the biggest gun, but who had the people behind them. The stalemate drew the attention of the ultimate power in the underworld, the Commission. Charles Lucky Luciano and the Italian families watched with growing interest. They saw Schultz as a liability, a rabid dog that was drawing too much heat. Conversely, they looked at Bumpy Johnson and saw a businessman. They saw a man they could reason with. Bumpy had achieved the impossible. He had forced the Mafia to respect him. He had taken a numbers game, a nickel-and-dime racket, and defended it against a hostile takeover by one of the most violent syndicates in America. As 1935 drew to a close, Bumpy stood at the absolute peak of his power. He had held the line. Harlem was still his. But he knew that a wounded animal is most dangerous when cornered. Schultz was desperate, bleeding money and respect. The final act of this tragedy was approaching, and Bumpy knew that only one of them would remain standing when the curtain fell. The Harlem Godfather checked his watch, adjusted his tie, and waited for the Dutchman to make his fatal mistake. In the criminal underworld, there's a golden rule. You can kill a rival, you can kill a witness, but you never, ever kill a man of the law. It brings down the kind of heat that burns everyone. Dutch Schultz, consumed by the stress of the mob war in Harlem and an impending tax evasion trial, forgot this rule. Or perhaps he simply didn't care anymore. By late 1935, Schultz was a man possessed. The stalemate with Bumpy Johnson had bruised his ego, and the relentless pursuit by Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey was threatening his freedom. Cornered animals bite, but Schultz wanted to do more than bite. He wanted to tear the system down. He went to the syndicate's ruling body, the Commission, led by the calculated genius Charles Lucky Luciano, and demanded permission to assassinate Dewey. The room went cold. Luciano and the other bosses knew that killing a high-profile prosecutor would bring the full weight of the U.S. government down on the Mafia. They denied his request. That should have been the end of it. But Schultz, furious and unraveling, made his fatal mistake. He declared he would do it anyway. In that moment, he ceased to be a boss and became a liability. The order was whispered down the line. The Dutchman has to go. While Schultz was plotting murder, Bumpy Johnson was practicing patience. He watched from Harlem as his enemy self-destructed. Bumpy knew that in the game of power, sometimes the best move is to let your opponent hang himself. He didn't need to send soldiers to kill Schultz. He just had to wait for the inevitable. On the night of October 23, 1935, the end came at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. Schultz was there meeting with his inner circle, believing he was safe, plotting the hit on Dewey. He stepped away from the table to use the restroom. It was a mundane moment that would become history. Two hitmen from Murder Incorporated, Charles the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mindy Weiss, burst into the restaurant. The air exploded. The hitmen sprayed the back room with bullets, cutting down Schultz's lieutenants. Then Workman kicked open the bathroom door. Schultz, the terror of the Bronx, the man who had declared war on Bumpy Johnson, was unarmed and defenseless. A single rusty .45 caliber bullet tore through his side, shattering his internal organs. He didn't die instantly. He crawled back to the table, bleeding out, while his empire collapsed around him. For hours, Schultz lay in a hospital bed, delirious with fever and morphine. Police stenographers sat by his side, hoping for a confession, but all they got was a stream of consciousness, a surreal, haunting poetry of a dying madman. A boy has never wept, nor dashed 1,000 Kim, he rambled. The G8 dying, the madman, died not with a roar, but with a whimper, taking his secrets to the grave. Back in Harlem, the news traveled faster than the wind. Dutch Schultz was dead. The invasion was over. But for Bumpy Johnson, the work was just beginning. The vacuum left by Schultz was dangerous. Lucky Luciano and the Italian families still wanted a piece of the Harlem pie. They had the guns and the numbers to crush any resistance. But they also remembered the war. They remembered how Bumpy had bled Schultz dry. They respected strength, and more importantly, they respected business. In a move that defined his brilliance, Bumpy didn't fight the Italians. He made a deal with them. He met with Luciano, not as a subordinate, but as a partner. They struck an agreement. The Italians would get a percentage of the numbers game profits, but operations in Harlem would remain under the control of Harlem. No more invasions. No more bloodshed. And the man in charge would be Bumpy Johnson. It was a masterstroke. Bumpy had secured peace for his community and consolidated his own power. He had navigated a path between the hammer of the law and the anvil of the Mafia. While Schultz lay in a cold grave, Bumpy walked into the warm embrace of the Renaissance ballroom, a hero to his people. He had survived the mob war not just with his life, but with his crown. However, victory in the underworld always comes with a shadow. Bumpy was now the undisputed Harlem Godfather, but he was also a king sitting on a throne of razor blades. He had won the war, but he had lost a part of his soul in the trenches. The years of violence, the constant looking over his shoulder, the friends lost along the way. It all took a toll. As he looked out over the streets he now ruled, Bumpy knew that the hardest part wasn't getting to the top. It was staying there without becoming the very monster he had fought against. The ghost of Dutch Schultz might have been gone, but the darkness he represented was always waiting, just one wrong turn away to truly understand the victory of Bumpy Johnson over Dutch Schultz. One must look beyond the blood-stained pavements of Harlem and into the soul of 1930s America. This was not merely a gangland squabble. It was a sociological earthquake. In an era defined by Jim Crow laws and rigid segregation, where a black man could be lynched for simply looking a white man in the eye, Bumpy Johnson did the unthinkable. He looked the Mafia in the eye and forced them to blink. For the average American reading the newspapers in 1935, the Gangland War was often painted in broad, sensational strokes. The press demonized Harlem as a den of vice and lawlessness. But for the people living inside the invisible walls of Uptown Manhattan, the narrative was different. They didn't see the numbers game as a crime. They saw it as the poor man's Wall Street. In a country where legitimate banks refused to lend money to black families, the numbers bankers were the ones funding mortgages, small businesses, and dreams. When Dutch Schultz tried to seize this economy, he wasn't just stealing illegal profits. He was attacking the financial independence of an entire community. This context transforms Bumpy Johnson from a mere criminal into a complex anti-hero. From a strictly legal perspective, he was a felon, a murderer, and a racketeer. But from a perspective of Harlem, he was the only barrier between them and total exploitation. He was the Robin Hood of 125th Street, not because he was innocent, but because he was theirs. The American public loves a story of the underdog, and in the history of organized crime, there's never been a greater underdog than the black gangster standing alone against the combined might of the Jewish and Italian syndicates. The contrast between the two antagonists also reveals a deeper truth about the nature of power. Dutch Schultz represented the raw, unpolished greed of the Prohibition era. He was a mad dog, a symbol of chaos that even the criminal underworld ultimately rejected. His death proved that in America, you can be violent and you can be greedy, but you cannot be disorderly. The system, whether legal or criminal, craves order. Bumpy Johnson, on the other hand, represented the future of organized crime, the corporate executive. He understood that violence was bad for business. He quoted philosophy, played chess, and negotiated treaties. He mirrored the aspirations of a marginalized people who wanted to be seen as sophisticated, intelligent, and capable of self-governance. When he sat down with Lucky Luciano, it wasn't a surrender, it was a diplomatic summit. This moment challenged the racial hierarchy of the time. It forced the white underworld to acknowledge that competence had no color. Furthermore, the survival of the Harlem Godfather exposed the hypocrisy of the American justice system. While special prosecutors like Thomas Dewey were hailed as heroes for chasing Schultz, the reality was that Bumpy operated with a level of impunity that suggested deep-seated corruption. The police, the judges, and the politicians were all part of the ecosystem. The mob war wasn't a battle between good and evil. It was a battle for the right to control the graft. Bumpy won because he played the game better than Schultz, understanding that a bribe is often more powerful than a bullet. Today, looking back through the lens of history, the story of Bumpy and Dutch is a dark reflection of the American dream. It's a story about the brutal lengths men will go to for respect and economic freedom. It reminds us that in the harsh landscape of the Great Depression, the line between a criminal and a community leader was often blurred by survival. Bumpy Johnson didn't just win a turf war. He carved out a space where a black man could be a king in a country that only wanted him to be a servant. This legacy, complicated and bloody as it is, remains one of the most fascinating chapters in the chronicle of American crime. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson did not die in a hail of gunfire. Unlike Dutch Schultz, whose life ended in the violent chaos of a chop house bathroom, the Harlem Godfather met his end in the quiet booth of a diner. It was 1968, decades after the Great Mob War had faded into history. He was eating fried chicken at Wells' restaurant in Harlem when his heart finally gave out. He died as he had lived, surrounded by the people of his neighborhood, a king in his own castle. His passing marked the end of an era. Bumpy wasn't just a survivor. He was a testament to the power of dignity in the face of oppression. He proved that intellect could defeat brutality, that a black man with a plan could outmaneuver a white mobster with a machine gun. He left behind a legacy that is as complicated as the man himself. To the law, he was a career criminal who profited from vice. But to the streets of Harlem, he was a necessary guardian. He was the shield that kept the wolves at bay when the law looked the other way. History often tries to paint men in black and white, but Bumpy Johnson lived in the gray. He showed us that sometimes, to find the light, you have to be willing to walk through the dark. He didn't ask for permission to be great. He took it. In a world that wanted him to bow, he stood tall. That is the true victory of the numbers game. Not the millions made, but the pride preserved. Some stories end without closure. But dignity doesn't need applause. It just needs to be remembered. If this story of the Harlem Godfather resonated with you, or if it reminded you of the silent battles we all fight for respect, please take a moment to like this video. Do you think Bumpy Johnson was a hero for his community, or just another villain? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you want to explore more untold stories from the shadows of American history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're just getting started. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember, history is written by the survivors.